Very warm welcome, everybody. Very warm welcome to this open lecture hall, Stockholm plus 50, 5 decades of global environmental governance. It was 50 years ago that governments, heads of state, met for the first time for an international summit to collectively solve global environmental problems. By the time at the Stockholm Conference in 1972, ocean pollution was already a key issue for sustainability more broadly. My name is Lena Patsch. I'm the professor of comparative politics at the Otto Suhr Institute, and I organized this public lecture series to take stock with you of 5 decades of global environmental governance. And today we hear about global ocean governance. For me, it's a great honor to welcome Alice Vadrot from the University of Vienna for this 3rd lecture of our series. I organized this lecture series together with several students, including Estefania. And Alice, before the floor is yours, Estefania is going to introduce you. Then Alice will talk for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session.
Okay. So welcome, everybody. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Mrs. Alice Batrod. She's an associate professor at the political department in the University of Vienna. Her expertise field is in international relations with a focus on environmental politics. Her achievements are recognized by the many positions she's occupying, such as visiting research fellow at the Center for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge, along since 2019 with being a member of the Young Academy of the Austrian Academy of Science, and as a senior fellow of the Earth System Governance Platform. Currently, she is the principal investigator of the project MARIPOLDATA, funded by the European Research Council, to study the new form of power covering the intersections between science, policy, and politics, with a specific emphasis on biodiversity and ocean governance. So thank you so much for coming to share with us your knowledge about ocean governance in our lecture series, and please join me to welcome Professor Alice Batrod.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's a very big pleasure for me to be here today. I think that this lecture, this open hall lecture, is a really amazing initiative, and thank you very much, Lena, for launching it and for inviting me. Yeah, what will be the topic of this lecture? In my lecture, I would like to give you a little bit of a background on the state of the ocean, on the state of ocean knowledge and governance, to explain why it is important to critically look at the Sustainable Development Goal 14 and current negotiations to protect marine biodiversity. I will let you know in the second part of the lecture what is my conceptual and empirical angle to look at this topic, namely by focusing on multilateral negotiations and by considering them as important sites of struggle over environmental knowledge. Then I will go over to introduce SDG 14, afterwards the Bbnj case, so biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. I hope an acronym that you will know by heart towards the end of this lecture. Then I will briefly sketch some alternatives discussed currently in scholarship on the kind of legal and epistemic orders that could underpin ocean sustainability, and then I will end with some concluding remarks and how we could go beyond SDG 14. So what do we know about the ocean? What's the state of knowledge about the ocean that we have? What you see here are a few screenshots from reports that have been published in the past decade to increase our knowledge about the ocean. The first one is the Census of Marine Life. That was an international initiative that covered many projects, over 500 expeditions on all over the world, included thousands of scientists to systematically close knowledge gaps on marine biodiversity in the ocean. And that led to the discovery of more than 1 million species that were new to science. The second report that you see is a report by the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science that was launched in 2021 and that goes now on till 2030, and that argues that we need more knowledge on the ocean because of knowledge gaps persisting and challenging ocean sustainability policies. I will briefly say a few words about that report later. The third picture that you see here with the sea turtle is the first and the second World Ocean Assessment. So there is no IPCC for the ocean. So these two assessments were launched at the UN level to systematically bring together the knowledge that we have on the oceans. And these reports have also increased the awareness on the need to protect the oceans in the past decade. Then the fourth report here, the IPCC report that also covered the ocean, so the effects on climate change on the ocean, and a report that you may also know, published by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services on biodiversity loss, here the global report released in 2019. So all of these international assessment reports and initiatives have contributed to bring the ocean into the focus of policymakers at the international scale. But what is the state of the ocean? So what we know, and this is a report that was published in 2013, is that it is clear that human activities have led to intense multiple stresses acting together in many marine ecosystems. So this is already in 2013 resulting in changes in the ocean in all regions at an increasing rate, and in some cases has also resulted in ecosystem collapse. So what we see is an overexploitation of biotic resources and something that the natural scientists call deadly trio, a combination of ocean warming, acidification, and hypoxia or anoxia. So this means areas where oxygen is too low or too high to maintain marine life. And then obviously pollution, as Lena mentioned earlier, pollution coming from multiple sources, including chemicals, particles, including microplastic, residential, industrial, agricultural waste, noise pollution, and invasive organisms. So although we have knowledge about the tremendous effects, for instance, of climate change on the ocean, there are still knowledge gaps. And in many publications that you read, scientists compare the knowledge gaps by looking at the moon. So they say we know more about the moon than we know on the ocean. I think this has maybe changed in the past decade, but still 260 zillion square meters of the deep area are in perpetual dark. I think we have to have this in mind when we talk about the ocean and about science about the ocean. There are only 5% of the seafloor that have been mapped in high resolution. Scientists estimate that 95% of ocean species have yet to be classified and that 95% of the oceans remain unexplored. And this report also states that 1 million species might still need to be discovered by science. So this is relevant because from the knowledge base that we have today, it is estimated that 99% of habitable marine areas lack basic biodiversity knowledge for their management and also for the underpinning of sustainability solutions. But it's not only gaps in knowledge that challenge ocean governance more broadly, it's also legal gaps. And when I talk about legal gaps, I mean gaps in current legal order related to the formulation of global sustainability policies. From a legal perspective, scholars would argue that there is a common concern of humankind to protect the ocean. And in Article 192 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that is considered like the Convention of the Ocean, it is required that states protect and preserve the marine environment, and this obligation is complemented by multiple treaties and conventions, sectoral treaties such as, for instance, the Fish Stocks Agreement, and conventions under the International Maritime Organizations concerning navigation and shipping. But there are also other multilateral agreements. You might eventually talk about them in other lectures in this open lecture, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity that was established in 1992 at the Earth Summit, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, or the Convention on Migratory Species. So all these different treaties matter when we talk about ocean protection, and especially about the protection of marine biodiversity. This lack of legal clarity on how to protect the ocean is accompanied by a fragmented institutional landscape. And what you see here is a screenshot from the United Nations homepage that tries to systematically show what treaties and conventions actually matter when we talk about ocean governance. So this is considered the ocean governance structure. And I cannot go into detail, but what you see is that there are already many organizations and treaties and conventions in place that regulate specific ocean-related aspects. So you see, for instance, here on the left side, you see mining. So the International Seabed Authority, for instance, regulates mining in the seabed. You have under the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, several sectoral agreements that regulate fishing and fishery activities. You have under UNESCO, the IOC, the International Oceanographic Commission, that regulates everything related to ocean science. So all of these different, international maritime organizations that I just mentioned, all these different treaties and organizations regulate specific sectoral activities related to the ocean. What they do not regulate is marine biodiversity protection, and what they also do not include is an overarching narrative that could guide ocean governance. And this is also where the Sustainable Development Goal 14 comes into place. So what we still need to do is, and that's an argument that guides my talk, we need to go beyond institutional fixes. So instead of asking, how do these different treaties and organizations relate to each other, how can they be streamlined, how could we increase their cooperation between them, we should go a step back and ask what the normative, political, economic, and epistemic orders are that underpin the global sustainability agenda. And this is why I propose today to look at SDG 14, and Bbnj negotiations, so Bbnj standing for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, and a treaty that is currently negotiated to protect marine biodiversity in the high seas, to look at these two processes and consider them as two important sites, two important negotiations that take place, or that took place, where struggle occurs. Struggle between state actors and also obviously non-state actors that is empirically observable and that can be studied in terms of actors' practices and strategies to maintain or contest the normative order, the political and economic order, and the epistemic order underpinning contemporary ocean governance. And this brings me to my research that builds let's say, the basis for this talk. So in my current ERC project, MARIPOLDATA, I use, or we, my team and I, we use multilateral negotiations as site of struggle. And this is like a picture that we took in the United Nations headquarters in New York. So when we study these negotiation sites, we work with collaborative event ethnography. As a team, we take part, systematically take notes of what is happening at these sites. And these sites matter because they are very restrained settings of political action, and they were or provided the framework for actually negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals and for negotiating also the future of ocean governance and new treaties needed to actually accomplish the sustainability agenda. These are just a few publications I did on the methodology behind the ethnographic study of these sites. And here are just a few things to let you know what stands behind this kind of approach. So basically, the assumption is that intergovernmental negotiation sites are sites where nation states come together periodically to review and advance the implementation of conventions or treaties by amending or further developing texts based on decision taking at, for instance, conferences of the parties or other intergovernmental meetings. The diversity of actors meets during these meetings, so they include state actors, non-state actors, academia, media, business sector, youth movements, but also local and indigenous communities. And these sites are important because actors going and attending these negotiations, they regularly update their knowledge by taking part at these sites. But to me, as a researcher, they provide an important opportunity to empirically examine the performance of power, authority, and legitimacy within this very highly and structured setting of international relations and diplomacy. And it is not easy to study these sites because of the diplomatic protocols and habitus that makes it quite challenging to understand what power relations actually are behind these scenes. An important assumption is that action in these settings is recursive and it repeats each other. It is shaped by historical past dependencies. So the negotiation setting, in this sense, establishes the terms of interaction, defines a horizon of possibility to also contest order at these sites, and it provides, as I also mentioned, the background knowledge of expectations, dispositions, skills, techniques, and rituals that are the basis for the constitution of practices and their boundaries within these settings. So action is recursive, and it means that it produces repeated patterns and forms of interaction between and among state actors and non-state actors in the negotiation room. And this is insofar important as when we talk about SDG 14, its emergence, the conflicts that shaped it, the contestations, why governments agree on specific targets, then this is not just for SDG 14. It can be considered as something that is important also for other sites, negotiations in the ocean governance framework and in relation to the different institutions and organizations that you just saw on the UN structure of ocean governance. So what happens at these sites? At these sites, meaning is made and struggle occurs. So negotiation practices are intended to impose meaning of, for instance, what ocean governance means, what ocean protection means, on indicators, variables, on the various elements of a treaty text, the forms of knowledge that are supposed to underpin these elements, and the exact language and terminology of specific sustainability goals. But meaning making in the negotiation room always implies a relatively stable order that is either reproduced by certain actors and stabilized, or that is contested in order to fit the interest of specific actors. And meaning making can also be studied in terms of analyzing struggle and contestation, which is something that I will try to do now by looking at SDG 14 and the Bbnj treaty. But let's start with SDG 14. So there were early on, before the SDGs were actually formulated and negotiated, several proposals made by different expert groups on how an SDG 14 could look like. So during the 8th session of the United Nations Open Working Group for the SDGs, several proposals were developed, many by academia, also civil society actors, and these were discussed. And these proposals, they highlighted different facets of ocean sustainability. They all emphasized that environmental issues are closely connected to human aspects, to economies, to how our societies are organized, and they all highlighted that humans receive benefits from ocean resources. So for instance, in these proposals, you can find terms such as blue wealth, blue growth, inclusive economic and human development, equitable access, or prosperous and resilient people communities. So these very close ties between the environmental and the societal aspect were inherent in most of these proposals. These proposals were all negotiated amongst United Nations General Assembly member states, so between states in the first instance, and they led to the development of a standalone sustainable development goal for the ocean. And this was not clear at the beginning. So at the beginning, it was not clear whether governments will actually agree to have one goal for the ocean. Yeah, so that's very important. So the SDG goal says or aims to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. That's the overarching goal. And here I just included the main targets under this goal. It's marine pollution, healthy oceans, ocean acidification, sustainable fisheries, marine protected areas, fisheries subsidies, economic benefits for small island developing states and least developed countries, knowledge and technology, small-scale fisheries, and law and development and implementation. So these are the 10 targets. And in a way, these targets can be seen as a step forward, especially the fact that it was all covered into one goal. However, it's also seen as something that is not a compelling narrative for the ocean. So, for instance, when you look into the targets and the different indicators that were developed, some of them simply do not fit or were not elaborated in a way that you could implement them in the next step. So I would like to give one example. So target, for instance, the target that talks about science and the need to increase scientific knowledge. It has a very narrow understanding of science, and there is no way that these could be systematically implemented. But what I said earlier, what is important is this recognition of the explicit socioeconomic dimension in these goals, and you can see it in specific targets such as Target 14.7 that considers the need of small island developing states and the least developed countries. So this is a vulnerable group that is very strongly integrated into SDG 14. You can also see it in Target 14A, which is an example that implies the need to increase scientific knowledge, to develop research capacities, and the transfer of marine technology. However, and this is what many critics say, this target and the set of targets offers little to articulate a compelling sustainability narrative for the ocean that has not already been repeated in numerous other texts. So some of the shortcomings, and I mentioned that earlier, I had it in my head before, but it's now the example I would like to give, is how to actually implement a target on scientific knowledge production and technology transfer and cooperation. So in the text, it is measured by the proportion of total research budget allocated to research in the field of marine technology. And if this is the indicator, then obviously there are many things that are neglected with such a quantitative indicator. So it neglects, for instance, the progress made in the past years to adopt a more reflexive approach to the conduct and role of ocean science more generally, but also the progress that was made to think about capacity building to close the knowledge gaps between the global north and south. And the second critique is that the SDG reproduces a very traditional and sector-specific approach to ocean governance. So meaning a focus on single economies, most notably the fisheries sector, or a focus on the needs of developing states and not more specifically related to regions. And the problem that, for instance, specific aspects are completely neglected, such as participations, gender equality, and human rights. These are other shortcomings that are addressed in the literature on SDG 14, mainly, or that can be summarized under the estimation that SDG 14 actually only has a narrow transformational vision for how ocean governance should look like in the future. So shortcomings that were identified are a lack of engagement with the financial costs of actually implementing SDG 14, social considerations such as labor conditions on vessels, for instance, but also how SDG 14 can actually contribute to poverty eradication, the long-term cultural importance of the marine environment. There is a critique that SDG 14 and the formulations focus on the ocean as a commodity to be indexed and used and measured, but not as a livelihood for people. And there is also a very narrow appreciation of ocean justice and global equality. So in effect, one could summarize this as SDG 14 reproducing a very narrow understanding of ocean governance, and SDG 14 as neglecting the issue that there is a fragmented institutional landscape which has been a hindrance to overarching ocean protection for decades. So scholars know that this fragmented institutional landscape poses a problem, but this is not at all addressed in SDG 14. So what does this mean? This means that, from my perspective, that we need a political debate that goes beyond institutional fixes, and we need to recognize the importance of multilateral negotiation settings as sites where, firstly, SDG 14 as a standalone sustainability goal was negotiated with all the shortcomings that come with it, as a site where state and non-state actors might refer to SDG 14 in attempts to shape the global sustainability agenda, but also as a site where struggle over normative, political, economic, and epistemic orders takes place and can be empirically studied. So the link between SDG 14 and the Bbnj negotiations that I will discuss now in the next section is argumentative, empirical, and analytical, in a way that states use SDG 14 to reproduce the logic within these goals, but there is also an empirical link because SDG 14 is or gets mentioned and is also traveling to other sides of negotiations, and an analytical link that I will present by focusing on the different orders. So the Bbnj case. I would like to ask, before I start with this, how many people in this room do know what Bbnj is or have heard about the Bbnj treaty? 4, 5? Okay, maybe those that read the text beforehand. Yeah, so the Bbnj, or Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction case, is so far interesting because it's a new treaty that is currently negotiated in the United Nations headquarters in New York, where states try to agree on the wording and the legal order that should underpin the protection of marine biodiversity in the high seas in the future. Yeah? But let's go a step back. So marine biodiversity, these are pictures. This is everything that you could eventually have in mind when you hear marine biodiversity. So from biodiversity on the coast to the deep sea, including marine mammals or specific species new to science in the deep ocean. This is a recent definition of marine biodiversity, so the elements of biodiversity that are fundamental properties of an ecosystem. And in the marine realm, these encompass all life forms, including the environments they inhabit, and at the scales from genes, species to ecosystems. So this is very important. It includes the ecosystems where species live in, the species themselves, and the genetic properties. It's especially important when we look at the contents of the Bbnj treaty that includes regulations on the genetic aspects as well. But as I said, the treaty looks at biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. What is meant by this? What area do we have in mind when we talk about areas beyond national jurisdiction? So basically the high seas is everything, and this is what you see on this picture, beyond 200 nautical miles from the coast of a state. So these are the high seas, and the high seas cover approximately 64% of marine waters of the surface and 94% of the volume. So this is everything that is in dark blue that you see on this picture. So it's quite a lot. And this new treaty aims to establish provisions and regulations for protecting marine biodiversity in everything that is dark blue. Yeah? So not in the other areas that you see that are national waters and exclusive economic zones and that belong to coastal states. So currently there are legal gaps regarding the protection of marine biodiversity in the high seas. And this is why in 2018 governments began to negotiate a new legally binding instrument for the protection and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And this new treaty is supposed to fill legal gaps related, for instance, to area-based management tools, including marine protected areas or environmental impact assessments. Yeah. So if you remember what we discussed earlier in relation to ocean protection, so you have UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that has Article 192 that puts an obligation on states to protect the marine environment. However, these regulations are not very specific, partly because when UNCLOS was negotiated, states did not have enough scientific knowledge to know that these areas would be rich in biodiversity. So in the 70s and 80s, when UNCLOS was negotiated, states had rather a vision of the ocean floor to be like a desert and not populated by species that do not just have a scientific value, but also an economic value. So just a very brief history of the Bbnj Treaty. So debates or discussions between governments to have a new agreement started earlier. So they started in 2006 when the United Nations General Assembly convened an ad hoc, open-ended informal working group to study issues relating to the conservation and sustainable group of Bbnj. So this was the Bbnj working group. And between 2006 and 2015, this group met 9 times. And they established a preparatory committee where governments discussed the key provisions and elements of the new treaty. So what should come into this text? And finally, in 2017, the United Nations General Assembly decided to convene intergovernmental conferences based on the results of the preparatory committee and the recommendations to establish a new treaty. And so this is when the negotiations officially started in 2018 based on the results and recommendations of this preparatory committee. And one important recommendation that this committee had was to address 4 specific elements in the treaty. I have 5 here because cross-cutting issues is always something that matters. So how do you organize the decision-making, the finances, the secretariat? But the 4 main pillars of this Bbnj agreement are marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building and transfer of marine technology. And the reason why this treaty covers these 4 elements, so some scholars argue that it was the attempt to somehow balance interests of states from the global north and the global south. So governments such as the European Union and the US and others had a very strong interest in Pillar 2 and 3, so area-based management tools and environmental impact assessments, and states of the global south were only willing to negotiate a new treaty if it included provisions on capacity building and transfer of marine technology that could close the big gap in scientific infrastructures between the north and south, and marine genetic resources. Yeah. And marine genetic resources, you may not quite understand why this is relevant, but I will just, I will explain it to you. So these negotiations are text-based negotiations, meaning that states meet on-site physically to agree on treaty language, line by line. And I will just jump to the first issue on marine genetic resources, why it's relevant. So these figures come from a publication in the journal Science. And what these figures show is that in the past years, there was a rapid development that led to patents on marine genetic resources in the high seas. So what you see here is that especially, around 2010, many companies and other institutions started to patent marine genetic resources located in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And this study of Science shows that 47% of these patents were actually registered by the German company BASF, 37% by other companies, and only 12% by universities. Yeah? So what this publication shows is that there is a big interest by companies, especially biochemical, pharmaceutical, and cosmetic industries on marine genetic resources in general, but also in the high seas, because these have specific properties that might be interesting for product development. Yeah? And why is there such a rapid growth after, let's say, 2010 or starting in 2007? And this can be explained by the fact that under the Convention on Biological Diversity, they negotiated the Nagoya Protocol, that regulates access and benefit sharing to genetic resources. And that implies that scientists and other actors that want to explore marine genetic resources in national waters have to agree bilaterally on the conditions to do so and have to eventually share economic benefits resulting from the utilization of these resources. So this means that a company or a scientist that wants to, let's say, collect a water sample in national waters has an overburdened bureaucratic process to do so. The same scientific endeavor conducted just on the other side of the border in international waters does not need any regulation. Yeah, obviously, scientists publish their work in open access journals or have to make the data available, but basically the increase of patents is linked to the fear that in the future the access to these resources would be restricted in a way or conditioned upon some bureaucratic procedure, or in the worst case, the need to share economic benefits. Yeah? And so what you see here is, just to clarify, in territorial sea, you have the CBD Nagoya Protocol that applies to access and benefit sharing, and in the high seas, there is no regulation. The regulation that applies here is UNCLOS Part 13 that regulates MSR, so MSR stands for Marine Scientific Research, and marine scientific research is regulated under the freedom of the high seas principle, meaning that scientific research in these areas is basically free. So in order to close the gaps and have a similar regulation in the high seas, the first pillar of the Bbnj Treaty tries to develop an agreement between states on how this access and benefit sharing could look like. Yeah? So basically, would scientists in the high seas also have to eventually share specific benefits of their research? Does it restrict this kind of research? What kind of mechanism will be implemented to also regulate marine genetic resources in the high seas and also to share the benefits? Yeah? And so this is an important conflict line between the global north and south. And in order for a regulation to be put in place that is more in favor of a global south perspective, many actors, especially the G77 and China, argued that they should include the common heritage of humankind principle into the text, meaning to consider marine genetic resources in the high seas as common heritage of mankind. So this is a quote that we took from our research. So this was Palestine that talked on behalf of G77 and China, saying, "We firmly reiterate that the principle of common heritage of mankind should guide the new regime of Bbnj in areas beyond national jurisdictions, including the access and benefit sharing of MGRs." So they stress the need that the text with all its options should, include the common heritage principle. And at the right side, you see, based on our data, we try to see what states are in favor of including the common heritage principle and what states are against it and what states are neutral. And so here you can see that actually most states prefer to include it, most states from the global south. States that are against it include Japan, the member states of the European Union, the Russian Federation, Australia, Iceland, and the US. Yeah? And so why is this actually relevant? It's relevant because the common heritage of mankind is already part of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in relation to mineral resources. So in the seafloor, in the area, if we go back to this, you see where it says no national rights. This is the area, so the seafloor beyond national jurisdictions. Minerals that are extracted from these areas fall under the common heritage principle, meaning that states and companies have to ask for a license to explore these areas, to do scientific research, and to exploit them. At the moment, there is no exploitation, so there is only exploration in specific areas of the ocean. And so the reason for asking for the common heritage of mankind here is to, in a way, decelerate the rush on marine genetic resources and to ensure that these are, in a way, that the benefits of them are equally shared among different countries. Yeah. Let's go to the next package element. It's area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. And this is just a screenshot from one of the text drafts, so you see how it works. And here you see, for instance, that the basic terms and the basic definition of what such areas include are not yet agreed. What you see here on the right side is a screenshot from another mechanism to identify marine protected areas under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So here you see that governments already agreed on specific areas in need of protection. They started this process in 2010. So basically, governments sent experts to regional workshops, and during these regional workshops, experts agreed on which areas in the high seas should be protected. And ideally, the Bbnj Treaty would look at these areas and define a procedure for their implementation, so for their designation and management. Yeah? And so here, states seem to agree that these areas should not be paper parks, so not just be on paper, but really protected. But in a way, it's extremely difficult at this moment to agree on what kind of activities in these areas are allowed and not allowed, how to govern them, and also based on what science and indicators. So in order to govern such areas, you have to constantly monitor marine biodiversity. You need constant data to see how these areas develop. However, this data is unequally distributed, as I will show later. Yeah? So this is something you need to keep in mind for the last package element. Then environmental impact assessment. So what are environmental impact assessment? To assess the potential negative effects of human activities in the high seas. And these are just examples that I have here. So an offshore wind park and an oil drilling platform. So these are activities, for instance, if conducted in the high seas in the future, they might require an environmental impact assessment. However, at the moment, it's unclear what activities these activities are, and if they include activities, for instance, only in the high seas, or also activities in national waters that have effects on the high seas. And then who should evaluate these impact assessments? So that's also something that is unclear at the moment. Even if you manage to have scientific data on the negative effects of activities, who will be in charge of evaluating if a company can go ahead? So this is also scientifically intense, data intense, and one big challenge here is the unequal availability of data on these areas. Then capacity building and transfer of marine technology. It's something that might explain some of the difficulties I just mentioned earlier related to data availability. So you see here on the left side, this is a map that I produced together with my postdoc, Batrod. And what we wanted to understand is the global distribution of marine biodiversity knowledge. And we did that by focusing on scientific publications in peer-reviewed journals. I mean, this is just a proxy, obviously, but it helped us to at least understand its global distribution. And what you see here is that, so we had 25,000 publications published between 1990 and 2018. And what you see here in purple is, for instance, these are countries that publish a lot and that get a lot of citations. Other countries, for instance, in red, such as Brazil or China, means they publish a lot, but they receive in a proportion less citations. So there is also a problem of how scientific knowledge is recognized. We focused only on English-speaking literature, so there is definitely a gap also in looking at other journals in other languages, but at least this gives us some idea on the distribution of marine biodiversity knowledge. And what you see on the right side is taken from a report of UNESCO, And this report tried to estimate the distribution of infrastructure to study the ocean, and they focused here on research vessels. So they counted all research vessels that conduct research in marine areas. And I think all in all, it's approximately 1,100 research vessels, and 441 belong to the US. Then you have Japan, Sweden, Canada, Republic of Korea, UK, Germany. And if you look at the distribution of positions related to the common heritage principle, then you actually see that these are the states that do not want to consider the ocean or marine biodiversity as a global common or as under the common heritage of mankind principle. Yeah? So you have a division in the room between states that do marine science and states that do not have the capacities to do marine science and collect scientific data in the ocean, which is in so far problematic as an implementation of the treaty needs science-based decision and needs data to be actually able to designate and manage marine protected area or to also conduct environmental impact assessments. This is another study that we did that is interesting. So we looked at collaboration capital. This is a notion that we defined, and its distribution on regional scientific cooperation networks. So collaboration capital is something that states can receive. So we basically calculated every state has 100% of collaboration capital they can give to others. And if we calculate this on the basis of our sample, we can see that the US, for instance, or the European Union, they receive most collaboration capital. And then we calculated how do regional networks based on these metrics look like. And for instance, the first one, Europe, is extremely dense. So you have a lot of cooperation between European member state institutions. But if you look at other regions, especially Latin America or Africa or even Asia, they have very low regional cooperation. So they do not cooperate with each other in the region. They tend to cooperate with the US or with European Union countries. So this is a problem that we see, especially when we talk about ocean governance in terms of regional efforts. So regional efforts are also challenged by the fact that scientific cooperation in the regions is not very well established. Yeah? Okay, so how I look at these developments and these negotiations is to understand these as conflicts or as a struggle between orders, between normative orders, political and economic orders, and epistemic orders. And by using these different terms, I try to cut through the negotiations and understand the main problems in contemporary sustainability agendas in relation to the ocean. There are, however, a few alternative legal and epistemic orders for ocean sustainability that have been developed by colleagues or that are currently floating around in other non-ocean related spheres. So, for instance, a stronger focus on regional scientific cooperation structures, such as, argued by my colleague and myself on how scientific cooperation could look like, but also the concept of ecological connectivity, which is very promising. So ecological connectivity is the idea that different marine ecosystems are connected. So in effect, it challenges the idea of an ocean divided into different legal maritime zones. So if you take this as granted, the idea of ecological connectivity, you would actually have to rethink the law of the sea, which is something nobody wants to do, but in fact, which is something that science asks us to do. So does it make sense to have national waters, to have international waters? Should we rethink these borders? Then a third aspect is transformative change. So for instance, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has argued for transformative change. At the moment, there is a lack of debate on how to link ocean governance with transformative change and what it might mean. So that's another avenue for an alternative framing. Polycentric governance, for instance, which was already developed by scholars in relation to ocean governance, Or an alternative framing that I like a lot is the wet ontologies framework developed by my colleague Kimberly Peters and Steinberg. So the idea of wet ontologies, if you think back at marine protected areas, yeah, it actually does make no sense to think of them as two-dimensional space. The ocean is three-dimensional. Yeah? And I think something that is behind this wet ontologies framework is to consider the ocean as something that is very fluid and that is not captured by our static thinking, that is part of this idea of borders, of territories, and to criticize the fact that we expand this territorial thinking to the ocean, which is a completely different space. Yeah, so just some concluding remarks. So the link between the SDGs and the Bbnj negotiations that I see is related to the mutual influence that you see when you focus on the different orders. And the SDG process most certainly, and the Bbnj case very likely, they would both have profited from a formulation of ocean sustainability goals that was more open to these alternative epistemologies and governance approaches, so especially I think the ecological connectivity concept, and they would also profit from an epistemic landscape of global sustainability politics that is more diverse. So the other aspect that is also interesting, I have not said it at the beginning, but I think you have already discussed the other SDGs, so SDG 13 and SDG 15. So compared to SDG 13 and SDG 15, that are, let's say, that have the advantage of a very well-established institutional landscape for biodiversity and climate change, SDG 14 brings this positive aspect of being a standalone SDG in a very fragmented landscape of emerging ocean governance. So that's a positive aspect. So what I also see is that although ownership, equality, and accountability are core issues in ocean governance, they tend to be overlain by issues championed by interests of a different nature, which view ocean resources as a commodity to be indexed, to be used and traded for the short-term benefit of today's societies, regardless of the effects on future generations, rights, and needs. So even if you consider the common heritage of mankind as a really progressive attempt of some states to highlight the need to protect marine biodiversity for future generations, because that's also, in a way, inherent into the concept, there is a tendency to only focus on economic benefit sharing among, this generation. So for SDG 14, I think it may be too late to reopen this debate, but I still see some hope for the Bbnj treaty that is currently under negotiation and that might be concluded in August 2022 at the 5th Intergovernmental Conference. So if you are interested in this process, you should look into the media at the end of August. I'm sure if they will succeed, there will be some media coverage about this new treaty that I think has the potential eventually to reshape ocean governance. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting lecture, which gave us many insights into ocean governance, but also conflict lines and struggles regarding ocean protection and especially the protection of marine biodiversity. We now have some time for questions. So yeah, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to your place. And as we don't have too much time, we appreciate short and precise questions. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I have a quite general question concerning your last slides about the outlooks or alternative ideas for the future. And I was wondering whether there are some models that try to combine ocean protection measures with economic interests in a kind of integrated kind of green growth approach. And what do you think about these models? Do you think these kind of goals are even are compatible after all, or is this inherently contradictory to you?
Well, I think that responses to these questions need to be framed in a local context. I think it really depends on the local context, on the need of people that are dependent on the ocean, that live with the ocean. And so this is, I think, the tension that we have when we talk about the high seas. Obviously, we need an international framework, but for the other aspects, the dependence of people on the ocean for economic purposes, for their livelihoods, I think you really need a regional approach. And at the regional level, it might be possible. Yeah.
Did you raise your hand?
Hello, thank you very much. I had a question about these access and benefit sharing mechanisms. What are some of the proposals for like international access and benefit sharing? Because you were saying that in the Nagoya Protocol it's bilaterally, if I'm understanding correctly. And how would this look like on the international sphere?
So in the Nagoya Protocol, I can give you an example. I know a biologist. She wanted to conduct research in Ecuador, and she, in order to obtain the funding, she had to comply with the regulations, meaning that on site she had to cooperate with a scientist from Ecuador to do the research together, eventually also to train the person, and she had to ensure that the samples stay in the country. Yeah. So for the high seas, it's a little bit different. So the things that are this, because there is no partner. So if it's bilaterally, who could be the instance? So the idea here is also to have something like non-monetary forms of benefit sharing. So in a sense that cruises and research expeditions have to get a percentage of scientists from the Global South on board to pay back in a way. The other idea that is floating around is to have, for instance, some kind of a fund, so to have a percentage of benefits, economic benefits resulting from a specific product, to give that into a fund and to redistribute, or to use the fund for capacity building and technology transfer. So, for instance, Brazil made very detailed proposals, and for Brazil, the first thing that needs to be done is to have transparency when you trace the marine genetic resources, so to maybe have something like a unique identifier. So you take the water sample, you give a unique identifier, and then, you know, every time when you extract the DNA, when you translate it into digital sequence information, when this is stored in a specific lab used by a company, to make that transparent, because Brazil argues at the moment there is no transparency. We do not know who collects what and benefits from it. So making it transparent is the first step for an access and benefit sharing regime. And if you manage to trace that, and you could say, for instance, okay, BASF made €3 million based on that specific species or genetic sequence information, then you could say 20% of that goes into a fund, and that will be used for capacity building, for building the capacities in ocean science, for instance. Yeah? But that is something that many states want to prevent. So instead they say they will have something like pre-cruise and post-cruise information, so make transparent in advance of a cruise where it goes, what kind of route it takes, to invite researchers from the Global South to take part in the cruise, to train them, so to have that sort of benefit sharing by establishing possibilities to expand the kind of ocean science capacity around the globe. Yeah. And this is also something that is currently discussed in the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science, to how to actually do the capacity building, how to do the technology transfer. Yeah, but if I look at the negotiations today, I think it's not clear what will happen in the end, but I think a monetary fund is very unlikely. Yeah, I think it will be non-monetary.
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. My question was referring to the part on capacity building and the transfer of knowledge on marine biodiversity. And the question was how, if ever, local knowledge on oceans and on biodiversity can be integrated into the system. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a question that is discussed a lot at the moment. It's a big challenge. So in the treaty negotiations, especially the small island developing states argued for the inclusion of local and traditional and indigenous knowledge into the treaty. So every time there is a provision in the text saying this should be based on the best available science, they want to add including traditional knowledge from local communities and indigenous people. Yeah, so it's an objective. I think in research practice it is sometimes done. So I just gave this example in our interview that there's a French anthropologist group and they did very interesting, fascinating study about that. So but this was in national waters, and there, for instance, they try to recruit local people to take them on the vessels. They also go to markets. They ask people, what kind of fish do you have? So they try to take this local knowledge on board, sometimes involve also local people into the research, which is especially feasible if it's on coastal areas. But regarding the high seas, that's rather difficult. Yeah? And here comes the concept of ecological connectivity in, because knowledge on coasts can become relevant if you consider that species migrate and ecosystems are fluid in a way, because then it matters what happens on the coast, it matters for understanding what happens in the high seas. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. You were mentioning the need to focus on region instead of country by country, and especially developing countries. What are the first steps forward toward a regional view?
Well, I think you need an international treaty. I did not want to say you don't need the international one, but I think when you talk about the needs of people, it's always abstract. So if you look at the Sustainable Development Goal 14, they say we need to acknowledge the needs of the least developed countries. What are these needs? Yeah? So that's what I meant. If you talk about these issues, you really have to go and see what needs people have instead of formulating abstract visions. So I think that both is needed. A regional approach that is also very strong at the moment in ocean governance. So for instance, there is the Ospar Convention. The Ospar Convention regulates the North Atlantic. It's an agreement between states that try to agree on how to govern and protect the North Sea Atlantic. They also have identified marine protected areas under this framework. So this is already happening. But what I especially mentioned is that you should not just focus on the governance structures at the regional level, but also at the scientific infrastructures and the knowledge structures at the regional scale, and foster these. So if you increase cooperation between scientists and other knowledge producers at the regional scale, I think it's more likely that at least you can have more sustainable agendas at the regional level. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. My question goes more towards the alternative ways of governance. I was asking myself, how do you assess the possibility of private regulation and, for example, certification such as MSC as a way that goes beyond the UN treaties and beyond borders?
Sorry, can you please repeat your question?
Yeah, how would you assess the importance of private regulation, such as MSC or other certification initiatives?
I'm not an expert on this, so it's difficult for me to say. But what I can say about private actors is that private actors are increasingly interested in marine scientific research. So there are some of the top vessels that are funded by private private initiative. So there is a very famous private entrepreneur in Norway, for instance, who is trying to build one of the most innovative research vessels. So I think that these initiatives are important, but I cannot tell you about the others that you just mentioned.
Thank you very much. I would like to know more about the ecological connectivity. Could you just tell a couple of words about, for example, the unit of assessment, so to say, like how you sort of border in the ecological connectivity unit? How do you, for example, imagine the basis of structuring this kind of approach? If that's clear.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in the first instance, it's a scientific, natural science approach. And it's quite interesting because it was really, and we showed this in a publication that will be published I think in a few weeks. It was strategically brought into the negotiations in the first instance to get Global South countries interested in the Bbnj process, because initially, they said, well, why should we care? This is so far away from our coast, 200 nautical miles. Why should we care about these areas? So in our interviews, we could see that UNEP WCMC and other non-state actors and academia, they really tried to bring this concept into the negotiations to get states attracted in this treaty. Yeah? And our argument in the paper is that when we look at how states then use this concept, it's always still within the same kind of fragmented governance thinking. It's not, they do not use it as revolutionary as it could be. Yeah? For instance, by asking, are these territorial boundaries the ones that will help us to advance global sustainability agendas? Yeah? How the ecological connectivity concept could be implemented to really change how we govern the ocean, I think a precondition for this would be to bring states on the table and to revisit the kind of agreements that they have made several decades ago. Yeah? But I would expand responsibilities. So to not just say, okay, this is now the national border and everything that happens after that, I don't care about it, but to establish a system that really encourages states to be accountable for their actions.
Yeah, I have another question, and here. Thank you from my part too. Yeah, this was super interesting. And if I understood you correctly, you said that the goal of the Bbnj's case is also to have a treaty that is legally binding, or legally binding instruments. I was wondering how, like legally binding to whom, first of all, like the ones that ratified the treaty, and what happens when countries with strong research capacities, such as the United States, don't ratify it, for instance. Or is it, I don't know, do they contemplate to somehow incorporate Bbnj to the NDCs, the country's NDCs? And another question is, because you said the Bbnj case would also come up with suggestions on how to implement marine protected areas. Is that correct? Yeah. But okay, what does this say about marine protected areas at the moment? I mean, they do exist, but does it mean that it's not clear at all how they are monitored or being monitored or implemented, especially in European waters? Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of questions. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know where I should start. Maybe with the marine protected areas. I mean, yes, the idea is that the Bbnj treaty will either initiate a process to identify areas, because these ones that I showed, they were identified in a CBD process, and so some actors, they push against them for different reasons. One reason being that they might be outdated, because some of them were identified 10 years ago. So is this area still in need of protection, or does new scientific data show actually it's not here, but it's maybe already here? So this is one point that is unclear, but I think that many of the protected areas, I think it really depends on the context again. I think that some states might do a good job in managing their marine protected areas, but I'm not sure that this is the case for all of them. So, for instance, Brazil used this initiative from the CBD to identify many areas in their national waters, and I know from interviews that they already started to, to remove some of them or to make them smaller because they just discovered a new oil reserve, so they just move it around the oil reserve. I mean, these are things that happen, so I'm not convinced that marine protected areas are the best way to protect, but I think it's a way to put numbers on the table, and there is a high ambition coalition at the moment between states saying that they want to protect 30% by 2030. And if they really agree to do that and have them as no-take areas. So I think this is an important decision, what activities are allowed and not allowed. So does it mean a ship can pass through the marine protected area? Does it mean a ship has to, pass through, but not as, with another tempo, or does it mean, or does it mean that no activity is allowed? I think this is already regulated, for instance, by the International Maritime Organization. They have this concept of particularly sensitive sea areas, so they also have a concept of marine protected areas. So I think this will be a challenge in the future.
Excuse me, I have another question, please. Given the dynamics in the negotiation side, is it likely that the discussions around the Bbnj treaty can result in a legal framework for environmental reparation due to damage to Bbnj, even if the damage is, in quotes, contained within international waters and not breaching what we deem to be transnational environmental damage, as the ICJ usually treats in jurisprudence?
I'm really sorry. Can you please repeat this?
Sure, of course.
I think it's better without the mask.
Yeah. Given the dynamics in the negotiation side, is it likely that discussions around the Bbnj treaty can result in a legal framework for reparation due to damage to Bbnj, even if the damage is, in quotes, contained within international waters and not reaching to national waters, as the ICJ usually in the jurisprudence treats as transnational environmental damage? So if the damage is contained within those international waters, may it result in reparation?
Mm-hmm. I think you have to ask a lawyer, to be very honest. I don't feel confident answering this question, but I think that this is something that came up in our interview. So ocean governance at the moment, it's really populated by legal scholars and lawyers, partly because of UNCLOS as main regulatory framework. And as a political scientist, I have to engage with the legal issues, but I don't feel confident to respond to all of them.
Okay, thank you very much, Alice. Thank you also for all the great questions. We have to finish up a bit earlier today. Thank you so much for this really interesting talk. I think we all know about climate change politics and are aware of the key features, but for ocean governance, obviously there still is a lack of research and a lack of knowledge, as you said. So thank you very much for the talk, and thank you for the great questions. And next week we will talk, today we spoke about salt water, so next week we will talk about fresh water and SDG 6, and I hope I will see you all again, and thanks again, Alice. And also I have something small for you.